Welcome to the Great Resignation, a special series of Let's Talk About It, brought to you by Stearns Financial Group and dedicated to discussing the most relevant financial and economic news impacting the investment market. In this edition, the conversation focuses on a term coined to describe the unprecedented numbers of people intentionally leaving the workforce provoked by COVID-19. It's called the Great Resignation. What is it? What factors are causing it? Is it about to end, or are we looking at a lasting trend? And most importantly, how does it impact you? Whether you're a boss, an employee, a consumer, or an investor. If you like what you hear, please be sure to follow and share. Now, here are your hosts, Dixson and Lindsay Brock.
And welcome back to episode 4 of The Great Resignation. My name's Dixson, and I'm joined with Lindsay Brock, JT Thomas, and Holly Madasser. And this is our final episode of The Great Resignation. And so far, we've covered what the Great Resignation is and is not. We've also discussed some of the trends that were in place pre-pandemic that have been accelerated. And in this episode, we're going to cover what's next for the Great Resignation. So throughout 2020 and 2021, we saw millions of Americans quit their jobs. A lot of that was because of the pandemic. Maybe people who were working more in service-related fields wanted to feel safer, and they had the ability to do so because of the tremendous stimulus provided by the government for all of us to feel a little bit safer. We've also seen some accelerations of trends within the labor markets, whether that's hybrid work or working from home. A lot of companies have adapted to the environment that we're in. Now that we're kind of on the other side, hopefully, of the pandemic, fingers crossed, we'll see what happens in the future. But as we move into kind of the new normal, we're starting to see a tick up in the labor force participation rate. And so while we haven't seen necessarily some of the employment numbers that we saw pre-pandemic, we're starting to see some of those trends start to change. However, we are also seeing trends come into place that maybe weren't here pre-pandemic. Just, JT, in some of your research, what are you kind of seeing within the broader labor force currently?
Well, it's a real good observation. Obviously, we are tracking that labor force participation very closely. And even in the last 6 months, we've seen pretty significant change there, where I believe that the labor force participation, the percentage of the working age population that is actually seeking work or employed, has jumped up about 4%. So pretty significant change recently. But there's clearly, we've talked about throughout this series, those broader trends. And, I think in the long term, we're going to look back and see the COVID-induced changes being just another phase of some longer-term trends. So, things that are seeming to stick is with the great demand for workers, and I think we're going to get into some of this a little bit later in the discussion, perhaps. But with that great demand, there's a lot more flexibility and accommodation to things like phased retirement. Obviously, the hybrid workforce, the so-called blending of work from home versus work from the office, is going to be here for a good long while, at least. I think one of the headlines this morning was talking about 1 to 2 days a week in the office seems to be the quote sweet spot for a lot of workers. So, those things will continue to evolve. But I think focusing on that phased retirement for a minute, there is obviously an awful lot of knowledge represented by folks who may be in the, say, 55 or 60 plus segment of the workforce, and they may be looking for a different mix post-COVID. They hopefully have had some pretty good success with maybe some of their savings. Certainly among our clientele, we're seeing this. And so they do have more flexibility, but they're not ready to kind of step off the railway for good. So they're looking for some sort of a blend there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I might be the only boomer on right now. So speaking as a boomer, I do think that transitioning out of work as opposed to complete retirement or resignation is probably what a lot of people might covet. And that's it's hard to go from 100 miles an hour, in the workforce to, I know people think they want to play golf 24/7 and travel around the world, but we see this a lot with our clients. After about 6 months, boredom starts to set in, and we just can't assume that recreation is the same as intellectual stimulation. For most people, it isn't, especially now with longer and healthier life expectancies. I don't think most people want 35 years of recreation potentially in retirement. So I think this allows this sort of phased retirement allows more freedom of time, maybe exploring encore careers, doing something different, but keeping a foot in the door as a way to remain mentally engaged. And as you both alluded, Dax and JT, helping with that brain drain, just stepping off when you have a bunch of retiring people who are experienced stepping off the treadmill and you're left with a much younger workforce. That lack of continuity and institutional knowledge just kind of walks away. So I think it's good for younger people, and I think it's good for older people to just have sort of more of a phased transition.
Yeah, and I agree. And that's a lot of times what we're doing with our financial planning and talking through with clients is making sure that they have a plan. So it's not just, you're right, Holly, going 100 miles an hour and then immediately stopping to do all recreation, whether it's reading and traveling or golf, but to have something that looks a little bit more like transitioning away from what you did so actively for 40, 50 years. And so I think that's healthy, but in addition to go off of what you mentioned about the younger cohort coming in, for any of us or the generation X, Y, and Z who are coming up in the workforce, that allows them the bit of transition into the leaders in those businesses and careers, so they can start to learn a little bit more heavily from those who might be looking at retirement. And so I think that's really helpful as well.
And Lindsay, we'd probably be remiss, particularly from speaking of the financial planning aspect, to not cite the benefits of having continued connection to work in terms of benefits, literally, medical, healthcare, continuing to have some contributions to your Social Security or deferring the start date on that Social Security plan. So all of these things, even continuing to fund retirement plans, 401ks. So, just having even a more modest participation in the workforce can really provide an extra buffer in your financial planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do also want to touch on the encore career, because a lot of our clients, or even, I'll use the example of my mother-in-law. She's interested in retiring and volunteering more actively. And that's something that it doesn't have to look just like, going to a soup kitchen and volunteering your time a little bit. It could be taking, a position for $10, $12 an hour where you're working with pets or children or whatever, a position that maybe you wouldn't normally have taken in your chosen career, but it's something that you feel passionate about that might just provide for those medical benefits that JT you mentioned, allowing you to reach either your Medicare age or something else, and you're able to kind of relax in your encore career.
And Lindsay, you know this from planning, but we've done plenty of plans where that incremental $20,000 a year has a huge compounding effect. So it's not just the benefits, the actual income doesn't sound like much, but if you're not withdrawing that from your portfolio and it's getting to grow over the next 20, 30 years, it's a huge impact in terms of your terminal value, let's call it, of your assets.
Absolutely.
So, looking at statistics, it depends on sector, but you're seeing around 25 to 50% increase in the phased retirement, and just like higher wages, more demand for women coming back in the workforce. I think this is absolutely a reaction from the market due to some of the brain drain that we've seen from the workforce over the past couple of years as people did enter into early retirement. I think I saw a statistic about 2.6 million boomers retired throughout 2021, which is significantly, or 2.6 million more than expected. And so if you're looking at a labor force shortage right now, I think some of this phased retirement is just a market reaction to that, which is obviously needed. Lindsay, you made a great point as far as being, growing in responsibility as a younger worker, having access to those resources and those subject matter experts who have significant experience is invaluable as you grow within your career. And then obviously you have the financial planning impact to the person who's doing more of a phased retirement. If they want to sort of start phasing out at 60, they still have access to medical benefits. They still have access to 401k plans and stuff like that. And JT, you alluded to, you just get to delay that Social Security a few more years there. I think from all sides, I think that is a win-win and very much needed right now, given some of the dynamics we are seeing within the labor force. And we didn't even touch necessarily on the, the lack of immigration. Maybe some of that's due to the pandemic, the lack of maybe even skilled immigration coming to America to seek opportunity. So that being said, we'll transition now and talk about, some things we were worried about pre-pandemic, when one of those was just that automation would take over the world. We've all seen the Terminator, we've all seen the Matrix, where the robots just completely take over humanity and we no longer have any jobs. And so I don't think that we've necessarily seen that play out. We're kind of seeing the opposite now. So what's happened, Holly? Where have all the robots gone? Have we avoided the doomsday scenarios?
Well, I do have a funny story to tell you, because I have two kids that are software engineer types. And one day I was talking to my son and I said, "What is the biggest risk to your job?" And he said, "Oh, Mom, that's easy. It's the human." And so I really feel like, as great as automation is and robots are, we're the ones that are programming them. We're the ones who are telling them what to do. All they're doing is leveraging our skill sets, right? And so I don't think we can lose track of that. However, with that said, I think we would not have this stay at home and the success we had during the pandemic of being able to work remotely was almost 100% due to technological advances, right? I mean, we had Zoom, wireless, computers at home. We were able to effectively transition and do that. So I think that we're going to continue to see more technological advances, and given the shortage of labor right now, we're really going to need that, with supply chains being as tight as they are. And, we're not clear at this point what's going to happen with Ukraine, Russia, but we're seeing a lot of China, a lot of supply chain shortages. We're going to have to start reshoring some things, and lower labor force participation rates doesn't help. So I think we're going to have to rely on automation to help get us through this gap.
Right. So JT, Holly makes a good point here. I think one thing that the pandemic has taught us, especially early on, more the glaring examples around PPE, such as masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, maybe pharmaceutical reagents. A lot of those were made in China and other supplying partners throughout the globe. So now that we have, number one, a labor shortage, and the fact that we maybe learned a lesson that we do need some redundancy in supply chains. What do you see as far as, maybe lower skilled labor here in the United States, or even some of our trading partners in North America, as well as, the impacts that might have on inflation in the near term?
Yeah, really broad question. There's a lot of interrelationships there. I think to Holly's prior point, it's really kind of a both and, right? I mean, we're going to need more automation wherever we can apply it, because we do have a shortage of workers in certain areas. Well, in broad scale areas, to the trade piece, we're going to see probably more of a regionalization or a hemispherization, if you will, of doing some things that it's not truly onshoring, but it's some combination of having better control across your supply chains, having greater diversity of supply chains. That has some inflationary consequences, right? Unfettered globalization, for all of its ills, was the cheapest means of production in many respects, right? So there's going to be an incremental cost that's implied by that. But it's really, to your earlier point, it's really hard to answer for. We talk about the U.S. economy being about 70% services, only about 30% manufacturing. So you think about, where does automation play most efficiently in that? And part of the reality being, it sounds good to talk about reshoring your supply chains, but it requires labor to do it. And so are we actually going to have a bit of a long-term trade-off of saying, rather than importing goods, we're now going to have to be importing people to produce those goods to the extent we're trying to do it here? So that obviously has a lot of political overtones as to how you solve that problem, but it's going to be a problem that the U.S. is going to need to find solutions to if we want to maintain our productivity and our capacity here.
Yeah, and to that point, JT, I think that, the political part is illegal immigration. So obviously we're talking about legal immigration. So we need supply of workers. And if we can't get that domestically, we're going to have to import that, to your point.
Yeah. And I mean, to your broader point, Dax, this clearly is a very intense phase in a longer term trend. And that longer term trend being the shift to services-based economies, the shift towards utilization of smart robots, whether that be in the service sector or in the manufacturing. But I think also the mix of what role does work have in society? To your labor force points earlier, it's interesting to observe that the participation in the labor force by, quote, prime age males between 25 and 54, which I'm rapidly approaching the end of, is about 10% lower than it was in the 60s and 70s. Now, there's a lot going on in terms of society changes, but that's about 5 million American men who actually aren't in the labor force, aren't participating today. And there's all sorts of questions. Many of those are hopefully good outcomes where men have other choices they can make now and maybe are supporting their spouse, traditional spouse, being in the workforce at a higher income. And so they're able to remix that division of labor at home. But it's an interesting observation of how much of the US male population is making other choices now. And what does that mean long term? As we've talked about before, I tend to think that's something that's going to moderate over time. And as we have other options, increasing wages, you're going to see that participation rate creep back up over the coming years.
Great point, KT. And as you mentioned earlier, we have started to see, at least in the broader U.S. labor force, re-entering into the workforce. I think you mentioned about a 4% uptick in the labor force participation rate over the last 6 months, which again is people kind of in that 16 to 64 range who are able to work. That's kind of your labor force, and the percentage of those that are actively seeking work or employed is do you have a point, JT?
Just to point out that actually brings us back to virtually on par with where we were pre-pandemic.
Yeah. So I guess, Lindsay, what are some of the factors that we've seen over the past couple of months? We clearly, a lot of states and municipalities throughout the U.S. are moving back towards normalization, whatever that may mean, maybe dropping mask mandates, dropping vaccine mandates, whatever new normal is within that particular area. What are some of the factors that you're seeing that are maybe encouraging people to get back to work?
Right. Well, I think the most obvious one that we could talk about is that the stimulus all have ended, right? And so you would assume that people's cash on hand would be less. We actually know that's not the case, and there's historically high rates of cash in people's pockets and in businesses' pockets. So that probably is not one of the biggest reasons, but instead we might be learning to live with the virus, considering that this is going to turn into a more endemic phase, and it will be more cyclical, and it's not potentially as common to see these big flows in with new variants. But also, I think a huge point is back to Holly originally actually talking about automation in the workforce and remote learning, or excuse me, remote work, not remote learning. But I think we are seeing employers become more flexible. And I think that's huge is, if you're looking for a reason to re-enter the workforce and you're being offered potentially the same wage you were before or the same career level, maybe even higher, but especially better benefits like working from home 3 to 4 days a week, or just extra added perks. In addition, maybe an office stipend to decorate your office, maybe at home, something like that. That's giving you more of a reason to step back in. And we talked last episode about women stepping back in, but I think that goes for really anyone who's had to scale back or step back from the workforce and why they're re-entering.
I think too, if I could add, is that in addition to the benefits, people are just negotiating higher salaries. So we're hearing a lot about how employers are paying bonuses just to get people to agree to work. And they're paying them a bonus a month later for them to agree to have worked a month. And so this probably goes back to the fact that real wages have not grown. In fact, they're down since 45 years ago. And so there's probably a correction that was needed anyway, and the pandemic precipitated that. And so we're now seeing the uptick wage inflation, good for the worker, perhaps not so good for the employer. But I do think that that's luring people back into the workforce, is that they're able to negotiate more of the job that they want at the price that they want and in the working conditions that they want.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that I don't know the answer here, but how we've seen pretty high levels of inflation over the last few months, which hopefully will mitigate as we make our way through the remainder of this year. But I think how much of that is putting pressure on people, though it might not be really affecting their savings right now. It's threatening to their cash flow. And so they think maybe we should start tiptoeing back into the workforce.
One thing I'd like to add is definitely the school reopening side has been very helpful for especially those parents with school age children. I know we talked about it a little bit last time, but the pandemic did force families throughout the United States to reconsider the mix of work for both parents. And, unfortunately, sometimes that may have fallen more on the mom to do a lot of the caretaking responsibilities and the de facto teaching. And now that you have a situation where schools have reopened, they can now reassess whether one or both parents want to re-enter the workforce. Maybe some have discovered that this works better for them, but those moms and dads that do want to get back to work have been able to do so, if for no other reason that now that schools have reopened, you don't necessarily have some of the back and forth that you had during the pandemic about, oh, we're open, we got to shut down for a few weeks because of a flare up in cases within the school. It's less common now. And so I think that has been a big boost for families across America to kind of reassess those working, their decision to work and how much they want to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess the elephant in the room is none of us mentioned the vaccine, but
yep.
I don't know how we forgot that, but we have over 200 million Americans that have been vaccinated at this point, and many more who have contracted the virus. And so I'm guessing, herd immunity, we finally have it. And so that has really enabled people to return to a more normal life, which includes work, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's herd immunity. I definitely think that we're, as a society, probably more resilient to the spread of the virus, or at least the more of the nastier consequences of the virus, like hospitalization, potentially death, because either we've been vaccinated or have had it. And so we have those a little bit more resistance to the virus than certainly we had when it was completely new to everybody a couple of years ago.
Yeah, let's hope that Omicron too stays in Europe.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
And that serious illness is not gonna, even if it comes here, that the vaccine protects against serious illness and hospitalization, as you say, Dax.
Yeah. So transitioning to our final segment of the Great Resignation, we've talked about a number of trends that were kind of forced by the pandemic or accelerated by the pandemic. And so, JT, I'll let you kick it off. What are some of those trends that you think are kind of here to stay, and maybe a couple of trends that you think, this is discussed a lot within the media and we see a lot of headlines on this, but in my opinion, we're probably going to moderate from our wherever we're at currently within that trend.
Great question, Dax. We have hit on some of those themes already. Again, I think that we're going to see the labor force participation. We've already seen labor force participation jump back up. I think that we are going to have some version of hybrid work be very common for the long term, but it's going to be probably less and less pervasive and a little bit more kind of sector by sector or job type by job type. It's going to have to adapt to the type of work that's required. Again, I think that human nature being what it is, we like that social interaction. We're going to find ways to restore to having that person-to-person contact. We've already kind of resumed much of that activity. But yes, on the margin, I think we're going to have a little bit less business travel, for instance. We're going to have a little bit more work from home participation over the long term. Would love to hear others' opinions on what are the trends that may have gotten a little overblown in this, and which ones are really here to stay.
Yeah, I've just been intrigued because for decades we've been talking about globalization and urbanization, and it feels like the pandemic has at least slowed both of those trends somewhat. And I wonder how much of that is permanent versus transitory, not to use that word, but I do think that that de-urbanization with remote work is something that can continue to stay at least at its current levels. I'm not saying that big cities don't have allure, more opportunity, so on and so forth, but it does make it possible for many people to work in less expensive areas closer to home. And I do think that that's a good economic and social stimulus for parts of the country that haven't experienced that before.
Holly, you're prompting a thought. I wonder to what extent that is a little bit of a boomerang effect linked to that kind of stage of career dynamic, in that, is it still necessary to get your first break, as it were, to get that early career phase in one of those more dynamic urban areas where the gross level of income is higher, and you only are able to capture that flexibility maybe in your second stage or your third stage of your career? I'm speculating there.
Yeah, that's probably right. But yeah, at least it does provide opportunities for people to do that at some stage of their career.
To your earlier point, foster some entrepreneurship, some startup in some of those areas of the country that maybe didn't see as much of that in prior decades.
Well, I certainly think that, some of the work from home, accelerating that trend within the economy has been a boon for people, especially in the Lindsay's and I age bracket, because we can now, as we hit those family formation years, maybe move out of those primary level cities. I think that's a trend that's probably going to be here for a while. As you see, there are people that take strollers on the subway, but for the most part, once you start having kids and things like that, you want a yard for them to run in. And so I think that is why you're seeing maybe some move into the suburbs there, or even second tier cities throughout the country, not to state the obvious. But I do think that that's a trend that is stay in place. The globalization trend, or de-globalization trend, I think it's nice to think about or speculate on. However, I think practically in the next couple of years, as China moves away from no tolerance policies, things like that, and maybe vaccinates more of their population, gets more resilient at the country level, we'll probably see a move back towards or moderate that deglobalization thing. I don't think that we're going into basically Cold War 2.0, because the economic ramifications of that are fairly high. And I'm not sure across the globe if all economic actors or us as people would want to pay that price. But that's my opinion. I think there will be some on the margins, reshoring of supply chains in certain strategic areas. But I don't think it's going to come into these just two trading hemispheres or anything like that.
Yeah, agreed that as a general rule, consumers and manufacturers want to reduce prices. And so that's a strong incentive for globalization. So I'm in agreement, Dax, that I think the deglobalization trend, and that's not to say that we might not reshore some very important things that we need, like medicines and things like that, having learned from this lesson. But as a whole, I think globalization is here to stay.
Yeah, and even as we start to reshore some of those resources and move into the next phase of our economy, I think one thing we have learned is we still have a shortage of workers here. Even if we have this uptick and continue to see an uptick in the labor force participation rate, I think the Great Resignation has showed us that we have more flexibility now than we did pre-pandemic, as far as where we work and when we work. The gig economy was certainly, you started to see that move up. So working for Uber, DoorDash, those types of things, like on-demand work. And I think that's here to stay and maybe accelerating. But the pandemic has definitely shown us that we need more workers here in the U.S. We're starting to see we need more experienced workers, more skilled workers as well. And we have had some positive economic impacts, as we've seen people, I think you've alluded to it several times, Holly, where your real wages in certain sectors hasn't increased in 40 years. We're starting to see some movement there, which is spilled over to broader inflation. But it's my hope that long term that's good for all parties involved. So with that, I'll open it up. Any other parting thoughts that any of you may have about the Great Resignation?
No, I say no and then I continue, but I think that the one parting thought I have is that I think the Great Resignation, or at least as it's been penned, is a bit of a misnomer. And we've applied many different terms to it. The Great Negotiation, the Great Renegotiation, the Great whatever, and I think that it's part of just the workforce evolving. We might have had our hand forced a little bit by a global pandemic that we didn't see coming. But I think that all in all, it's forcing good things to happen, where people are continuing to move in and shift into their more preferred ways of living and either earning income or living their lives.
Yeah, that was going to be a point that I would add to this list, is sort of the empowerment, personal agency that people have found through this pandemic, that they can renegotiate the way that they live their lives. And so that's a good thing.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. As JT would say, that the Adam Smith's guiding hand of the economy, I guess the economic term, JT, is people now have a greater ability to maximize their utility curve or something like that, right?
Good, Dak. Back to your Econ 101. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. So I think on balance, it's a good thing. I'm a big believer. If the more freedom people have, the more leverage to negotiate through time, the better economic outcomes that we as a society will be able to enjoy in the future. So I do think that there's some good things about the pandemic. Obviously, there's some negative health outcomes, to say the least. But I'm hopeful for the future of work here in America. I'm hopeful that this is putting in some positive trends that have, pretty impactful economic outcomes for individuals and our country and our markets over the long term, certainly our clients. So with that, I will resign. This is the Great Resignation of this particular podcast series.
No, Dad, it's the Great Migration. You're migrating to something else, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm migrating to something else. And thank each one of you for joining me through this series. And I hope each of you have a great day. And thank you.
Stay healthy.
Oh, take care.
Stearns Financial Group is an investment management firm with offices in Chapel Hill and Greensboro, North Carolina. Securities are offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower Advisors, LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Refer to brokercheck.finra.org for more information. This podcast is copyrighted and all rights reserved. The content of this podcast is for information only and not intended to serve as financial, legal, medical, or any other form of professional advice.